In this episode, we are going to talk about the transformation of the trading world in India in the course of the 18th century. If you look at the early part of the 18th century, we find certain traditional centers of trade flourishing. Centers like Surat, Calicut, Masulipatanam, where indigenous traders had concentrated. These indigenous traders were participating very briskly in the intra-Asian trade, both with West Asia and with Southeast Asia. But as you come to the end of the 18th century, you find that the British East India Company had by then emerged as the only powerful trading factor. I mean, others certainly continued to exist, the Dutch, the Danes, the French, other European competitors, but they had marginal entities in the Indian trade, and the British domination over Indian commerce had become overwhelming. I mean, no room was anymore left for Indian or other European traders. It is well known that Surat was the preeminent Mughal port, but along with Surat, you have other important centers of oceanic commerce as well, like Calicut or Cochin in the south. You have a whole range of smaller ports along the coastline from the Arabian Sea end to the Bay of Bengal littoral. And all these ports were connected through the sea lanes of Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, Eastern Indian Ocean, with ports in Southeast Asia like Achin, Bantam, Pegu and Tenasserim in Lower Burma. As you proceed further, you go to the Indonesian archipelago, Sumatra and Java. And in the west, you have the connection maintained from Surat and also from other ports on the Arabian Sea and on the Coromandel in the east, with Red Sea ports like Persian Gulf ports like Hormuz or Bandar Abbas or Red Sea ports. So you have an elaborate framework of intra-Asian trade in which the ports of India played a critical role. And each of these port towns had a concentration of both indigenous and foreign merchants. Some of these foreign merchants, like the Arabs, had been visiting these ports since the 7th, 8th centuries. The Europeans also arrived on the scene in the 16th century. Portuguese were the first to arrive. Then you have the Dutch becoming more powerful in the 17th century. The English also took interest in the Eastern trade from the 17th century onwards. But then by the 18th century, the English, as we have already said, we were triumphant. But all these ports, as you know, were fed by the commercial centers in the hinterland as well. And an understanding of what these commercial centers were, what was their nature, it is possible to identify different kinds of markets. For example, in the Indian literature, you come across mention of rural marts. Now, many of these villages were actually self-sufficient villages. The artisans produced commodities which the villagers themselves consumed. But the villagers also had to depend on the supply of certain essential items from outside. Salt, for example, one such commodity. Iron was one such commodity. The implements were not always locally produced. They had to be imported. So these rural marts very often sold exotic products, some of the necessaries, some fancy items, luxuries, which the local markets imported from the urban markets in the adjoining regions. Some of these urban markets were not large-scale markets of the kind that you would find in port towns like Surat or in Hooghly in southern Bengal, but these markets also sold very special items. So these urban markets in small towns also had something special or exotic or luxuries to offer to the consumers. But over and above these small urban markets, you come across the very significant emporia, where you will come across not merely very important goods, commodities, exotic goods imported from the overseas countries, from West Asia or from Southeast Asia. You will come across concentration of bankers, financiers, ship owners, wholesale traders, and retail traders. So such people who were actually very active in these port towns to continue this very complex network of maritime and oceanic trade also had to draw on the resources from within the country, from the hinterland, and there were connections between the ports and the hinterland, and this is something which requires to be borne in mind when we find that there has been an excessive emphasis on the international trade, in historical research, on maritime trade in historical research. There are certain reasons for this, because of the easy availability of archival information about these European companies in the European archives. It has been easier for the Indian historians to reconstruct the history of oceanic trade more elaborately than it has been possible to lay our hands on the complex arteries of local trade.
So then what were the main trade routes in India?
Actually, it is once again a very difficult problem, because some of these trade routes, some of the ancient trade routes over time became discarded, new routes had emerged. But if you look at the 17th century, the early 18th century, you are expected to distinguish between two different kinds of trade routes. Some of these were waterways, coastal and riverine. The main riverine trade route in northern India, obviously, the great river, the Ganga, which connected important urban centers of northern India with Hooghly, and then once Hooghly declined, replaced by Calcutta. But alongside this riverine trade route, you have also running parallel to this riverine route a land route as well, which would go up to a very important overland emporium in Agra. And Agra was another very important overland emporium was Burhanpur. And Agra and Burhanpur in turn were connected with Surat. There were two routes. One went via Malwa and western Rajasthan towards Agra, and the other came southwards and connected Agra with Surat. Apart from the coastal link, Masulipatanam, a port on the northern Coromandel, was connected with present-day Chennai, Madras, or some of the smaller ports around that region. So, if you actually if you were a trader, say in the 18th century, and were making an assessment of waterways or the advantages of the waterways and the advantages of the land routes, then waterways were usually preferred because it was less expensive and it was less hazardous. But land routes also continued to be very important, because from Agra, as you know, land routes actually moved towards West Asia through Khyber and Oxus. You have the caravan route, and different kinds of carriers, animals were used as carriers. So the waterways certainly had a degree of importance, particularly in the coastal trade, since if you look at the Indian coastline, apart from some of the major ports, some located on the sea or some located slightly in the interior region on the confluence of major rivers. Hooghly, for example, was a riverine port and one of the most important centers of trade in eastern India. Surat was an oceanic port, or Calicut in the south was an oceanic port. But apart from these major centers of maritime trade or oceanic commerce, you have between two major centers of trade, smaller centers of trade as well. And some of these centers also, thanks to the growing demand for certain items like, for example, textiles, emerging as important centers of manufacture. Bengal textiles by the 18th century had begun to command respect from all over the world. European companies were taking Bengal textiles to Europe. On the other hand, Surat was actually encouraging the development of a textile sector in places like Ahmedabad or Broach in Gujarat. The food scarcity areas like Gujarat were importing food stuff from other places. It was not as if that the trade that was carried on through these land routes and waterways were simply in exotic items or in luxuries or in fine textiles. You have coarse goods. Coarse textiles from Coromandel, for example, were dominating the list of exports from Coromandel to Southeast Asia. Spices, of course, were very important, heavy in demand in Europe and other places. But apart from spices, many of these ports were actually regularly importing foodstuff. We have information of rice being exported to West Asia from Surat. And Surat or Gujarat itself was a food scarcity area which imported rice from Bengal carried through the coastal ways. So it is a very complex structure of trade where specialized centers of production were actually feeding into the business of the ports. Some of the ports were large emporia where exotic commodities were sold alongside bulk goods. Many of these ports were served by large banking houses, wholesale trading. There were smaller ports which acted as support to this very complex network of trade, connecting the ports from the west coast with the ports of the east coast. So within this particular structure of trade, the Europeans actually moved in since the 16th century. And this traditional structure of trade would actually undergo significant changes, not instantly, but gradually, to a point in the 18th century where this traditional structure of trade would be entirely disrupted.
So, what were the main features of this traditional framework of Indian Ocean trade?
One of the cardinal features of this traditional framework of trade was interdependence between different groups of traders. If you actually go back into the past, if you look at the trading structure in the 11th century or 12th century, much of which was inherited in modern times by modern trading agencies as well, you will see that the Chinese would be coming to one point, up to Southeast Asia or to Bengal. Chinese ships will terminate their journey in Southeast Asian ports, where the Indian traders would actually take their commodities and then sail up to the coastal towns, going up to the Maldives or Red Sea ports. Some of the Gujarati traders certainly would visit regularly. Their ships will certainly visit regularly Red Sea, Persian Gulf ports, but the Arabs were very significant actors in this trade. So the Arabs, the Indians, the Southeast Asian traders, the Chinese, all these were involved in a kind of relationship of interdependence in carrying on this intra-Asian trade. There was no one singular dominant factor. No one power was actually dominating this structure of trade. No one group of merchants would be dominating this trade. There would be multiple different classes of people, different types of people, different types of merchants from different regions. This interdependent structure was gradually disrupted. So if you look at the early history of European trade in India, the Portuguese used this intra-Asian trading structure very well. In fact, they sailed into this system very easily because apart from the official Portuguese trade, you have a large number of Portuguese private traders. Some of these were, of course, officials who carried on their private trade, but they were totally dependent for credit or for finance and at times even for shipping on the Gujaratis from Surat. One of the great late 17th century, early 18th century Gujarati merchants from Surat has been the main protagonist in one of the greatest historical works on the subject by Professor Oshin Das Gupta on decline of Surat. His name is Mullah Abdul Ghaffur. Owning large ships, financing trade on a large scale, his agents going up to the Red Sea, Persian Gulf region. So it was with such people some of the Portuguese traders actually maintained a collaborative relationship. But at the same time, as we know, that in certain regions where they were in a position to exert a greater amount of military power, they introduced the cartage system. The Indian ship owners had to buy passes from the governor of Goa to secure themselves against piracy or confiscation of goods by the other Portuguese ships. So this was perhaps one of the earliest attempts to break apart the kind of interdependent relationship that had existed in the traditional framework of intra-Asian trade, in which the Portuguese penetrated, became a part of it, became integrated into it, but at the same time made certain efforts to break it apart. The Dutch in the 17th century would do it more confidently, more vigorously. In the Southeast Asian waters, they would completely marginalize the Portuguese, and they managed to enforce a certain kind of monopoly over the entire spice trade of Southeast Asia to a point where these Gujarati traders who were regularly visiting Southeast Asian ports would no longer find much incentive to go to Southeast Asia. So the focus mainly in the 17th century for all these reasons would be on West Asia, Red Sea, Persian Gulf region, on which the Indian trading groups actually concentrated. We also have evidence of merchants of Hooghly using Machilipatnam shipping to carry their commodities to Surat and via Surat to West Asia. So the English on their part also used this network very efficiently in the early part of their trading career in India in the 17th century. And by the early 18th century, all these European companies were active except the Portuguese, which had seen better days, but by then the Dutch had marginalized them very substantially in Southeast Asian waters. The English had emerged as a more powerful competitor. The French had come on the scene, but the French would exercise some amount of commercial power only during the second quarter of the 18th century. By the middle of the 18th century, the conflict with the English would actually settle the issue in favor of the English. So in this kind of a constellation, when the Europeans were trying to establish some kind of commercial hegemony, less successfully in the 16th century, more successfully in the 17th century, and more overtly in the 18th century through the agency of the English East India Company, the traditional network of trade that we were talking about actually failed to survive. And one important symptom, one important manifestation of the manner in which this traditional network collapsed, or the manner in which the traditional network was completely ruptured, was the decline of Surat.
So then what are the reasons for this remarkable decline of a port which had commanded so much wealth even in the early part of the 18th century?
Yes, it's a very important question, and it cannot be simply explained in terms of the contraction of Southeast Asian markets for the Gujarati traders, because the Gujarati traders, while losing the Southeast Asian markets, were still very active in the Red Sea Persian Gulf region, certain coastal areas of East Africa. The decline of Surat had also something to do with the internal convulsions in India, because 18th century was the time when some of the more stable regimes in West Asian trading zone also had begun to undergo decline, political decline. The Safavid Empire became weak. The Ottomans were also going through the same process. The Mughal Empire had started declining, especially after the death of Aurangzeb. You have a series of succession troubles, and the North Indian trading route became affected by the periodic warfare. The Marathas were moving towards northern India and disturbing the normal flow of money and commodities on the land routes which served the port of Surat, which linked the port of Surat with some of the overland emporia in North India or some of the major production centers, for example, Lucknow. So, while political disturbances or political upheavals and troubles in the West Asian trading zone had deprived Surat of its lucrative markets, the severance of connection between Surat and the hinterland, between some of the major centers of manufacture in North India, some of the major centers of trade in North India like Agra, largely due to political instability, largely due to the manner in which armed peasants were actually pouncing upon the trading caravans, pouncing upon the traders. All this actually created a situation in which the Surat trade failed to survive. So there was an overall commercial decline in the early part of the 18th century, caused by partly by political instability within India and partly by the more powerful assertion of hegemonic aspirations, hegemonic ambitions by the Europeans. The Dutch, they had lost their leverages, but by then the English were rising. And the rise of the English and the manner in which they reoriented their trade from the West Asian zone to the Southeast Asia in order finally to carry on their trade with China, in order finally to control the route to China, was manifest in the growing importance of what is known as the Calcutta fleet. The number of ships in Calcutta in the early part of the 18th century owned by the British was more small. But by the mid-century, it had a large fleet. And in comparison, the Dutch were not in a position to compete with the British in terms of allowing other groups of traders the kind of tonnage that English ships were able to provide. If you look at the Southeast Asian trading lanes, you see gradually the British establishing their control by eclipsing the Dutch. The China trade was, of course, the main objective the British were nursing. And it reached its climax in the later half of the 18th century, partly because of what is known as the domination effect of the East India Company on the arteries of trade in India.
So, what is this domination effect? How does one explain this domination effect?
In the first place, the British Company had greater financial resource. The greater financial resource came from their control over the local revenue. As you know, that this local revenue was converted into bullions and then carried to China in order to finance their China trade. They bought tea and silk from China and exported them to Europe, exported them to Caribbeans, exported them to Americas. So a multilateral trade which the English company actually conducted all over the world came to be financed by the premium that they were receiving from their control over the revenue from Bengal. So this was an advantage which its other competitors didn't have. Secondly, as I have just mentioned, that the number of ships actually which were operating in this traditional intra-Asian trading network in the Bay of Bengal littoral and through the Bay of Bengal littoral towards the China Sea, for the British had complete command. Thirdly, and this is very crucial, already from the early part of the 18th century, the English had already started establishing certain kind of control over the hinterland of Calcutta. You are all familiar with the kind of privileges that the English company had received in 1717 from the Mughal Emperor Farrukh Shah. So much so that a time came when many of the internal traders, not just the oceanic traders who are now in the absence of other ships, in the absence of Gujarati ships, in the absence of indigenous shipping, were using English ships to convey their commodities to Southeast Asian ports. Not merely those, even those trading groups from Calcutta and Hooghly who were not interested in maritime commerce, who were interested in conveying goods and carrying goods to northern India, were making use of the English boats simply because of the reason that the English boats didn't have to pay any taxes. The financial resource that the British control over revenue had provided became a great boon for the British traders in comparison to other competitors, both indigenous and foreign. In the course of the early part of the 19th century, however, the British found an alternative in opium. Once opium began to be exported, Malwa opium found Bombay the more important transit point. And it is said that the rise of Bombay was entirely indebted to the flourishing opium trade that the East India Company carried on with China. There was a time in the late 18th century when the company was in fact contemplating the closure of the Bombay commercial establishment. It was only with the expansion of the opium trade that finally Bombay emerged as one of the major ports in India, early 19th century India. But by the early 19th century, as you can now see very well, the kind of trading structure that you had seen in the early part of the 18th century had been completely altered. The rules of the game had already been changed. And as a continuation of this changing rule of the game in Indian commerce, India ultimately became a part of what was known as the colonial trade. There was a time when British Indian textiles were heavy in demand, and the company's main interest was to carry Indian textiles to other places. But once industrial revolution in Britain enabled British manufacturers to produce textiles for cheaper cost, the Indian textiles began to lose their markets, initially in Europe, then in Southeast Asia, and a time came in the early part of the 19th century when even in the Indian domestic market, the Indian textiles started losing out to the fine textiles imported from Britain. Colonial trade had emerged by then. India was a feeder of raw materials usable in British industries, and textile almost completely disappeared from the list of exports. And this was the colonial trade making its powerful emergence in the early part of the 19th century, altering entirely the rule of the game that we had seen in the early part of the 18th century.